Thank you, Sue, and thank you so much, Jason, for that. That was a great additional piece there, and we can see how the picture is getting richer. And I think this is going to add to that further and build on what Jason has just been talking about. The limits of listening, and what this is going to be is a quick review of what can and can't be learned by passive research techniques. So first of all then, social media listening, what is it? Well, it's passive. It means that we are not taking part in the conversations. We're finding conversations. Those conversations are naturally occurring comments made in social media. What do I mean by social media? Well, obviously I mean social networks. So some parts of Facebook, depending on your view on what you can access, maybe all of Facebook. I think generally people would take the view, as Jason just did, that really there is an ethical distance you can reach into it. The public stuff and beyond that is a little bit more doubtful. Microblogging, so Twitter. People who are blogging, people who are adding comments to blogs, user-generated media, things like YouTube and Flickr, remembering that most of them also have a comment add facility. Comments on news stories, reviews on TripAdvisor, when people shout out on Foursquare that they've checked in somewhere, or Facebook Places, or GetGlue, all of these sort of things are creating a discourse, and passive collection applies to all of these. Going around and collecting them all together to create a corpus so that we can do something with them. What is collected? That which is said in social media, and by said I include videos that are uploaded, photos that are uploaded. So we can only collect that which is said, which is an important consideration because there are billions of things that are being said. I think Jason just said there were 2.4 billion likes being uploaded. So a like is sort of the minimum amount of things that somebody can say. In locations that can be legitimately be queried, a lot of social media is actually closed. You can only get into it with passwords if you remember and so on. So we're talking about the public social media, those things that you can see either without logging in or you can see very easily. Things that are not said can't be collected, and that is massively important when we try to work out what can we use social media listening for in terms of all the market research that we and our clients want to do, and what can't we use it for. So, what is said on social media? I'm going to run through these in slightly more detail, but people can talk about things that have happened. People can talk about things that they would like to happen, that they know they would like to happen. They can make personal statements and messages, and at a much more philosophical level, almost a Michel Foucault sort of level, they can say those things that are sayable. And I'm going to explore that and unpack that term a little bit more. So, things that have happened. Here are some examples of comments in social media for the last few days. How times have changed. Colleague walking around in office asking if anyone has a Nokia charger. Could you imagine this 3 years ago? So we can see from that that somebody is talking about Nokia and charger, and they're highlighting the difference between now. So it's also a personal statement. The second one across there, watching the new computer-generated 2012 Nickelodeon version of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It's certainly not like how I remember it, but I'm not the target. So again, we have an action, something that's happened. They were watching the TV, a nice bit of brand identification in there, and also a bit of a statement. And down in the bottom left, a man dressed as an astronaut gave me a Mars bar on King Street. This reminds us, of course, that things that have happened may not have happened. They could be imaginary, they could be misremembered. But these things all pertain to the real world and events that happen. The second is what people know they want. I need an iPhone with a BlackBerry or a Nokia battery. That would be the perfect phone. I want to get a job at Starbucks, learn how to make all the drinks and then quit. It's 2012. Why doesn't Starbucks deliver yet? So we can see all sorts of known aspirations, and you can see why brands would be fascinated in listening to what people's experiences with their products are, and why they'd be fascinated to learn about what people's desires and aspirations are going forward. Both of these could be really useful. We also have personal statements and messages, so they can be brand related. Anyone else remember how Nickelodeon's worldwide day of play was the worst day of the year when we were younger? I do. #antisocial. I don't understand why there's a caramel Mars bar when I swear normal Mars bars have caramel in them. So some quite brand related thoughts, but also so good seeing everyone tonight. I love you all. True friends forever. See you soon. Which kind of reminds us that the vast majority of comments in social media don't specifically refer to a fast-moving consumer good brand, a CPG brand, a standard service. They're more likely to refer to music brands. You saw the list of Facebook pages that Jason just put up a few minutes ago, highlighting all of those music brands out there. But regular brands are really quite a minority of the discourse. But there is certainly stuff out there about them, and that's all very interesting, very useful. The way we need to think about what is sayable is to think about what is unsayable. So we have unsayable things because of laws. We have bans going on in terms of different countries of what can be sayable. Sometimes social media is taken down if there are problems or protests. We obviously have defamation and libel laws. We have causing public offence. There are different customs in different countries, but it's not normal to talk about, I am thinking of breaking up with my partner. There are various bodily functions that are not often spoken about in social media or in any other circle. Probably the rule for what is said on social media is something like what is said in a public bar or on a bus. It's pretty broad. It's not very special to social media, but there are customs that are abided by that people don't talk about going in there. There are laws and there are system limits. Many systems will not allow you to put in foul language. They won't allow you to do various activities. Some have pre-screening. Many blogs have pre-permission before those posts are actually arriving. So there are various limits going on about what is sayable in that context. Most of those probably don't worry brand researchers and service researchers too much. Things that are left unsaid. I don't normally tweet that I had 60 pulse beats, heartbeats this minute. I normally don't say that I had a glass of water. I normally don't say all sorts of things that are normally left unsaid. And actually, it's very difficult from your own life to work out which things are always unsaid. It's one of the things that ethnographers and anthropologists find most interesting when they look at a new society or a new community. In any society, there are a lot of things that are unsaid because they are understood, which is fine. They're understood by members of the community. But when we start to look into those lives, we do not necessarily realize there's a lot of things that are being left unsaid because they're understood. Then there are things we do not have words for. So when I hear people who know a lot about cheese or wine talking to each other, and they will talk about woody notes and various things like that, I'm impressed, but I can't join in that conversation. I can taste a glass of wine and say, yeah, I like that, and taste another one and say, that's not my flavour. But I can't actually talk about the nature of the difference and what I like about it. A fragrance. Somebody standing next to me on the tube in London, and I think, oh, that's a nice fragrance, or that's not a nice fragrance that they're wearing. But I don't have the language to describe it. So I'm not going to go proactively out there And many of the people who we might do research with have an even more restricted set of languages and codes that they will apply, and they will talk about products that we're interested in selling, we're interested in researching, and we have lots and lots of things that we want to do and really fine differences. But they will tend to use words perhaps more as a blunt cudgel in the area of that product, either because they simply are not familiar with using these words in that context, or they don't know them in that context. Things we do not admit to ourselves. So all sorts of things about, we have a view, most of us, about how often we clean our teeth. We have a view about how often we clean the car. We have a view about how often we eat something healthy and how often we eat something unhealthy. We have a view about how often we eat chocolate. When most of those things are mapped against actuality with some form of data logging technique, it turns out we are less virtuous than we had intended to be. We are less virtuous than we thought we were. We give to charity less often than we thought we had. We consume those healthy products less often. We read the packaging on products less often. So all of these are things that we don't admit to ourselves, so we don't say them, because we're really not aware of that aspect of life. Coming back to what is sayable, we tend to say what others say on topics and what others talk about. One of the discourse analysts, one of the great minds, Mikhail Bakhtin, talks about things being dialogical. We normally say things in response to other people. In fact, we always say things in response to other people at some level. Far enough back, that phrase will have come through, we'll be echoing it back. The comment that people sometimes make that they can hear their parents' words coming out of their mouths. All of these sort of things, but you see it more and more when you look at social media. There is a very high degree of repetition. A topic becomes fashionable to talk about. So talking about what other people are talking about is sayable, and it's difficult and becomes marginally unsayable to talk about completely different things, and certainly becomes less likely that you are going to be listened to. If you keep talking about things that nobody else is listening to, then nobody is going to be listening to you, and it's hard to describe that as being part of the discourse. So what is sayable defines what we can research, and what is unsayable defines what we can research. Then we need to think about who is speaking on social media. And we've been doing some research recently at Vision Critical, and in the English-speaking developed economies, so I'm talking Australia, New Zealand, North America, UK, Ireland, and I'm sure some other places, apologies for having skipped over them, then most of Facebook is hard to search ethically. The Facebook pages that Jason was just talking about, yes, but people's own personal accounts are often set to private. Most of their comments on their own wall, on each other's walls, or the photos they've uploaded are often set to private. So it's difficult to go in there ethically and take those comments because they have not intended for those things to be seen. In those developed English-speaking countries, about 15% of the population are using Twitter. Twitter is very easy to search, it's very accessible, you can allocate geography to it, so it makes it quite attractive as one of the sources for information. Less than 10% of the population tend to comment or upload elsewhere in social media. So what we can see is that when we're listening to social media at the moment, in 2012, in the developed economies, we're listening at best to about 25% of people. When you look at the frequency of comments, when you look in the Twitter stream for where the bulk of that information is, we see a very clear 20-80 sort of rule. About 5% are doing perhaps 8%, so 1 in 20 are probably generating about 80% of the comments that we can listen to and that we can clearly ascribe to where they belong to and the sort of information. So we have an issue there about coverage. We're tending to listen to a subset of the 25% who are contributing to the discourse. probably to about 1 in 20 of the population. We also have an issue about salience, about what things people are talking about in terms of topics. So some brands are more talked about than others. Apple is talked about a lot. Intel is talked about a little bit. Food brands, cooking food brands, are talked about much less. Some topics are more talked about than others. Mobile phones, music, entertainment, these are talked about a lot. Travel is talked about a lot, usually fairly negatively. People are complaining about rail problems, complaining about traffic jams, complaining about the underground, but there is a lot of discourse about travel. There is much, much less discourse about types of yellow fat, so margarine and butter. There is much less discourse about cooking ingredients. There is very little discourse about different energy utility options that are within the home. So different topics have very different levels of discussion about them. Some formats and executions are more talked about than others. So if there has been a TV show or a TV program, then we see a lot of conversations about that. If there is some new point of sale, it's quite hard to pick up many conversations about it. One of our clients in the UK, CBS Outdoors, did some advertising on London Underground to announce their new community panel and to do a teaser campaign. And yes, some people did notice it and some people talked about it in social media, but it was such a small response compared with the notification of the Olympic Games that was also being advertised on the Underground, but also made it into other formats and other executions. So all three of these differentiate between the sorts of topics we can look at and not. So if you're looking at the Apple iPhone launch, and one of my colleagues is going to be presenting in the second session later today, and Joe will talk about some social media research we did into the iPhone launch, you'll find masses of comment in social media. It's a great place to go looking. If, on the other hand, you were the brand manager, marketing manager for Ashbourne Water in the UK, and there was some new point of sale material talking about the 3-for-2 deal in supermarkets, you would struggle to find anything in social media about that. You might have to come back and say, well, what can I look at about 3-for-2 deals in stores? What can I look at in terms of interest in bottled water within the stores? But even then, the information is going to be a lot thinner. So one thing that determines what we can research on is the salience of the brand and the salience of the message. So if we think back to BP last year, it would be very easy to research through social media BP and oil spills in Mexico because the brand and the topic had a lot of salience. It would be quite difficult to research, however, BP and issues with the logo or issues with the color scheme or issues with the clarity of the information on the website via social media, because although the brand had salience, that topic didn't have salience. So perhaps at this point it's worth stopping and having a look at the social media successes, because that's going to determine quite a lot about when we can use it. Some election polling, there have been some great work done. I saw some work on some of the French elections, some of the US elections, particularly in presidential elections as opposed to parliamentary elections, where following social media, particularly just following Twitter, was quite predictive of who was going to win and some of the movements going on within the marketplace. Campaign monitoring or management. If you've run an advertising campaign or a promotion, doesn't matter if it's for a brand or it's for a safety issue or public health, you really would expect there to be social media response. So you can look to see what the social media response is. You can look to see whether the campaign has been understood, whether it's being received positively, whether people are sharing that information. You can then reconfigure the management of the campaign back in by listening to that social media. Great paper a couple of years ago from Insights Consulting showing how they were doing social media monitoring with TV stations on things like talent competitions to help manage the talent competitions by listening to the social media. Social monitoring and management. So if you want to know what issues matter to the public and whether or not they've understood the remedies and how they're talking about things like austerity and financial crises, health concerns, inoculations, all of these sorts of things, social media has proved to be very successful in monitoring some of those. Fault spotting. If you want to know how many people are shouting out and how angry they seem to be about the fact that your mobile phone doesn't work very well for left-handed people, then social media is a great place to hear about what those faults are and what those problems are. Ideation. This is perhaps one of the strongest areas that the case studies that have been published for social media have come up with, looking at what people are saying to help generate new ideas. We've had within the commercial world and from brands like Unilever now, new deodorants, specifically for white clothes deodorants, for black clothes that tackle the clothes staining problem. So all sorts of ideas within social media and listening to social media to find ideas to take forward in product ideation and product development. Some customer satisfaction. So for example, the Synthesio and Acor have done a study where they look at thousands of hotels, they're looking at TripAdvisor and all of this sort of information, they're looking at people blogging, they're looking at people tweeting in order to be able to provide the customer satisfaction for what is happening in specific locations. So there are certainly some customer satisfaction stories out there which have been very successful for social media. Competitive intelligence. Finding out what people are saying about your competitor. What do they like about your competitor? This is actually also true for market research agencies. If you want to find out more about what your competitors are doing well and perhaps where some of the problems are, listening to social media is not a bad idea. This is even more true once you move into products and services. You're a bank, you want to know what people are saying about other banks. This is a great way to look at it. You're a mobile phone company, you want to look and see what the strengths and the weaknesses are of your competitors. This is a great way of going out there and having a look at strengths and weaknesses of your competitors. Why social media listening works when it works. On some topics, views are homogeneous, so something will crop up and people are angry or appalled or delighted. When we, in the UK, we've just had the Olympic Games. There was a lot of skepticism across the country. The 15% who we can access via social media were skeptical, and the 85% of the population we can't access through social media were skeptical. We know that because actually we were accessing most of them through Omnis and direct research studies. As the games started to work, as the UK started to win medals, those views changed. Those views changed for both the 15% who are online and the 85% offline. So whenever everybody believes the same thing, when everybody has the same sort of experiences, when everybody has the same sort of perceptions, then listening to a minority works. So we can afford to listen to social media and it's going to give us a really good picture. The second one is where the rank orders of preferences tend to be the same. So if I get a collection of people and show them 4 Pepsi ads, and I've got a proper random sample of all Pepsi buyers, and then I take 20-year-old Pepsi buyers from the north of the country, 50-year-old Pepsi buyers from the south of the country. I take Pepsi buyers who are really into rock and roll music in another part of the country, and I take Pepsi buyers who are really into jazz music in another part of the country, and I show them 4 ads for Pepsi. Most of the time, they will give them the same rank order. Unless jazz or folk music or something like that is part of the advertising. So our rank order amongst people who like things tends to be quite similar. Once you've managed to make the step into users of consider us of or whatever, it's quite common for rank orders to be the same, even when absolute scores tend to differ. And the final one is really what has underpinned most advertising tracking since time immemorial, and since advertising tracking was invented pretty much by Maurice Millward and Gordon Brown in the 80s, time immemorial would be the 1980s onwards. Most advertising tracking measures, most brand tracking measures, do not mean anything specifically. They're an arbitrary line. But when the line goes up, it's good. And when the line goes down, it's bad. So what we can see on social media is that if the 15% we can look at and follow are going up and down roughly in correlation with the rest of the country, then listening to them is going to give us a pretty good steer on whether the real picture is going up and down. And if you step back from statistical sampling for a moment and think about under what circumstances would the image of a brand or service be improving amongst the people who use social media, the 15%, and be getting worse amongst the 85%. It's quite hard for most brands, products and services, unless they are directly linked to social media and the internet, to think of a circumstance where most people would think the brand is getting worse, but the people who happen to use social media think it's getting better. So that's a curious one. It tends to work when we listen to tracking changes, provided we don't fall into the trap of thinking they have an absolute meaning. What are the challenges to doing listening research? Well, the first challenge is the incomplete coverage, that we're listening to perhaps 15% of the population, obviously much less under some circumstances, not often more. One real problem is that we have a changing base. So if we do brand tracking over 4 or 5 years, the number of people using the internet has gone up. The number of people using the internet from mobile devices has gone up. The number of people using social media has gone up. The number of people who understand that making comments about a brand has some sort of impact have gone up. They may also in the future go down. So when we do tracking, we like to keep everything constant. But we can't do that in social media because so many things are moving that we're looking at a moving figure from a moving base. There's a real problem for most of us about working out where comments are coming from in social media. There are some lucky people in the world. If you are Finnish and you are tracking comments in Finnish, it's likely that all of those comments came from Finland. On the other hand, if you are in Australia or the United Kingdom and you're tracking comments in English, the default is they probably came from North America. So you need to do something to try to separate those out. Some parts of social media, like Twitter, are relatively straightforward to get 85–90% chance that that comment has actually come from your country. By the time you move to blogs and so on, it gets to be a lot harder. So if people are commenting on an Australian news channel's comment page, yes, it's probably Australian. If people are commenting on the Huffington Post in North America, a fair number of those are going to be Americans, a fair number are going to be Brits. Anybody who is blogging via blogging.com or some of these type pads are going to look like they're in the US, but they're in fact going to be all over the world. So it's really quite hard to determine where comments are coming from in a wide range of social media. One of the things that tends to happen is as soon as you focus your social media coverage down to a geography, you tend to become much more dependent on Twitter and start drawing from a less wide balanced set. The demographics characteristics of people making comments. So even if you know that this person has come from New Zealand, you know this person has come from Singapore, you still do not necessarily know whether they're male or they're female. So what we like are where people have declared their own characteristics. But that is incredibly sparse when you look at social media listening. Most of those tools either guess the characteristics of people, or they just don't know. So we're starting to look at comments, but we don't know what the demographics are, we don't know what the characteristics are. We're also not entirely sure whether we're looking at the comments of people, the comments of organizations, or even bots, machines set up to retweet, find, post comments. So if we're looking at the success of a campaign story, we want to identify how much of that is coming from professional organizations who have been paid perhaps to promote the campaign. We certainly want to measure that because that's one measure of success, but we don't want to include those in the number of times that people have been impacted or noticed or talked about the study, because they're different. So if an organization is clearly identified as an organization, fine. A lot of organizations, however, look like people. A lot of bots look like people. And the final concern, I'm going to come to this quite a bit more in a moment, is gaming the system. As people know that complaining makes a difference, more people will start complaining. If organizations know that the compensation for senior members of staff is going to be dependent on the customer satisfaction score coming out of social media, they will feel like they should try to change those social media scores. We see this in TripAdvisor, where there are all sorts of accusations that people will put in negative reviews of their competitors' restaurants, things like this, in order to do them down. So there is a great ability to game the system with most forms of social media listening. And I want to adapt something that Rumsfeld said when he was Secretary of State or Defense in the United States. There are known knowns. These are things that people have experienced and they talk about in social media. There are known unknowns. These are things that people know that they want, and they can talk about those in social media. You know, I would like a bigger Easter egg. I would like Starbucks to deliver to my house. But there are also unknown unknowns, things people don't know they want. They don't know they're possible. They can't envisage. So this comes back to Ford saying, well, I didn't ask consumers what they want. They wanted faster horses as opposed to cars. There are limits to what we can get by just listening to what people ask for. They won't ask for the things that we might make possible, that we might want to do, that we might want to remove, we might want to change. So I'm going to come now and have a look at SMR reckon that there are about $33 billion worth of research in the world. These are the proportions, and I'm just going to run through how social media might impact all of these proportions. And this analysis is something you can do yourself at home, because you may come up with different results or outputs from it. But it's a nice technique for making a robust prediction of a scenario. So market measurement techniques. How many people are buying this product? How many people are using this product? This is sort of the strong ground of the Nielsen's and people like that. Its intention is to be incredibly accurate about the real world. It's all about audits and identifiable numbers. It's very hard to see much of that. It's 18% of the market research pot by value. I doubt that more than 1% of market measurement can be done via social media. I think social media may lead as an input into the process. I think that there may be a tiny number of cases where the usage and the market measurement is about social media. So 1% of 18% would say that 0.2% of the whole pot might become from social media in the future. Media audience research. Who is watching what? How long are they watching it for? This is an area full of gaming and litigation. There have been court cases against Arbitron in North America about does that method of measuring media research accurately reflect minority viewing. There are court cases in India where there are accusations that the media audience research measurements are not properly accounting for things. I think it's very unlikely that there would be many people who would be willing to go into a social media listening in this highly litigious area of claiming to be accurate about measuring the real world. So again, I think it might be 1% used as an additional input where the channels are very specific. Stakeholder measurement. Now this includes CRM, but it does include customer satisfaction. And I've shown one example of customer satisfaction where we're looking at hotels and TripAdvisor where social media listening is really useful. However, there are a couple of problems about social media and customer satisfaction, and even more about CRM, which is dealt with about specific purchases. So it's great for just listening to experiences, but if you want to know which store, and you've got 200 stores in the country, you need to do a survey about each of them in order to be able to give information back to the manager, to be able to do issues about their bonuses on those particular stores. Sitting around waiting for social media listening comments isn't necessarily going to help, and anyway you would run very quickly into the gaming problem. There'd be such an incentive to put gaming into that, to say, okay, let's try to improve the social media comments about my brand and my product and so on. So it's hard to imagine much of CRM type work, transactional work, and even customer satisfaction, the formal bit of customer satisfaction, customer enterprise measurement, moving over to social media. I've said a couple of percent. You might put a higher number, remember. So that's why I say, please do try this at home. That would lead to another 0.2%. New product source development. Most of this is about testing products. I've got this new concept. I don't want to tell my competitors and the public it exists. So if we weren't worried about competitors, then in fact brands could float all sorts of ideas about things they were going to do in social media and listen to the discourse about them. In fact, they don't do that. So where social media is being used and being used really well is in ideation, in some of those creation of ideas. So that's why I think it might be 3% of the pool for new product and service development. The majority of spend on new product and service development are with things like Idea Screen and Bases and so on, where people are doing testing of ideas that probably aren't going to be released to the market, which are relatively secret at the stage they're being tested, and where they want to have this additional confidence in the numbers. Advertising and brand tracking. Okay, I think this is going to be much bigger than it is now. I can see social media taking perhaps 25% of this in the future, because most of the advertising and brand tracking expenditure is for major brands. It is for brands that are advertised on the TV, that run major campaigns. So I can see that being perfectly viable once we've got a few more benchmarks, once we've got a few more processes and steps in place for a lot of this to be done via social media passive listening. If you're having a difference, you should be able to see and hear that difference. Usage and attitude studies. Yeah, I can see a chunk of that, maybe 10% of all of that in the future. Here is how I feel about the brand. Here is how I'm using it. Here are the sorts of comments that I make whilst using it. Because there's a degree of artificiality, actually, about most of the survey-based Q&As that we may be able to move away from with some of the social media listening. So that could be a chunk of social media work in the future. Market modeling, media mix modeling. Again, we're talking about lots and lots of inputs from the real world, real pieces of data, very quantifiable. We're not talking about the 15% who are talking online. We're talking about as close to the 100% as we get, econometric data. Hard to see social media being more than an input to that process, another strand, which is used as one of the many, many strands going into market modeling data. Opinion research and polling. Whilst Twitter polling and social media listening has proved quite good in some types of elections, particularly presidential elections, it hasn't proved very successful in a much wider range of them. It's going to be susceptible to gaming as we move forward. It's not as fast and rapid, frankly, as polling can be when done very efficiently. So I suspect that listening is going to be a very small part of opinion research polling, where quite often what the pollsters are looking to do is to push a question that the public may not be talking about in quite that terms. They want to put it in ways that expose the difference between one view and another. Advertising pre-testing. I can see social media being a major part of ideation for ideas within that. But again, pre-testing, you want to test this idea before it is released, before it's made available. You certainly wouldn't want to do it in places where people can do share and copy and link and all of those sorts of things. Hard to see much advertising pre-testing being done in advance. Now, as you can see, I've been working my way down this list from 18%, which is market measurement, down to the 3%, which is advertising pre-testing. We then get a couple of funny categories, really, because there are others, so we jump the numbers back up. Other qualitative studies, these tend to be ad hoc projects, and I think going forward, maybe 10% of those could be ethnography, could be social media listening. Now, people do qualitative when quantitative data is not giving them a rich enough answer, where they're trying to focus on meaning. It certainly will not apply to everything in social media because it doesn't have that probing that qualitative research often likes. But on the other case, natural occurring conversations, getting into the ethnography of people's lives, yeah, I can see it being maybe 10% of these other qualitative. And I see it being that partly by growing the sector. I think that it will make other qualitative actually a slightly larger group because it will raise some brand new possibilities. B2B studies. B2B is less good for a lot of social media listening, partly for reasons of confidentiality, partly because the bases tend to be smaller, partly because a lot of the topics are really boring. I've seen projects where people have tried to look at new white vans they've delivered to companies, and guess what? People are talking very little about the product performance of the new white van, their company has issued them, and so on. There are some much more interesting things, so engineers tend to talk about chips and processors and things like that in ways that are exciting. I can see it taking 5%, but hard to see it going much beyond that. Omnibus shared costs. Omnibus are for very, very precise questions. Social media is great for answering questions that you haven't defined clearly because it lets you answer the questions in a way that people want to talk to you. But if you have a very, very precise question, how many people have a cappuccino before midday in South Australia, then that is much easier with an omnibus than it will ever be with something like social media listening. Then there's other research, which of course is a rag bag, and I think that a lot of that will be social media, and I think that it will grow the size of other research. Social media is opening up new possibilities more than it is opening up replacement opportunities. So if we pull all of those together, then we might find that within 2 or 3 years, social media could be 6 to 7% of market research, which would be $2 billion at current prices. So it actually could be quite large. Most things can't be researched through social media. I'm saying over 90% of things we currently research can't be, or I'm saying over $2 billion of stuff can be. So that very much comes down to, are you a glass half full or a glass half empty? Just a few quick thoughts on the future. Legislation may restrict what we can listen to. There's legislation in the European Parliament for a right to be forgotten. There are new cookie legislations. There are privacy legislations around the world. All sorts of things could make it difficult to listen to what people are saying online. Social media could become more popular, which would make it more options available. Or it could become less popular. People may become more guarded. Many pundits expect people to become more reserved and less willing to comment online. I think they're bonkers, but they could be right and I could be wrong. So we need to, when we're thinking about scenarios, say it could become better or it could become worse. People could become more open or they could become less open. Tracking people and linking to communities may make the social media feedback richer. As we start to find people signing up to services that say, yes, you can track my mobile phone. Yes, you can track this because I will get my services cheaper or I will get a discount. Yes, Coles or Woolworths, you can track me, but I get an extra 0.5% off my bill. Yes, Sky or Fox, whatever, you can track me, but I get to see my program slightly cheaper. then social media listening in that context, what did people listen to? What did people say before they did something? That could make social media a lot richer as a tool. But I think that we're going to see listening morphing into talking to a lot more. So when people make comments that are interesting but don't quite answer research questions, I think there is going to be a growing range of tools, probably based around bots, that will enable us to say, can we have a conversation about that? What do you mean by that? Does it happen all the time or some of the time? How could we have fixed the problem? What would you like us to do to fix the problem? And those sorts of conversations. So 4 concluding thoughts. If people are talking about you, you need to listen. This is something you're going to hear in the next session as well. Social media listening is a must. Social media can be a great additional source of information, particularly for ideation, particularly for creating better research instruments. And in a few cases, social media listening will be a replacement method. But the main problems relate, first of all, to probing, getting an answer to a question that you really need the answer to. It gives you lots of answers to questions you didn't know you had, but it doesn't always answer the questions you do have. And how do we get to quantitative predictions about the real world from the social media listening of the things that people have said from the 15% who are saying them? Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.